You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today, returning to the podcast, is Ash Navabi. Ash, welcome back to Economics Detective Radio.
I'm excited to be back, Garrett. Thank you.
So, listeners who have been with us a while will know Ash, but his byline has changed. So, Ash Navabi is a senior economist at Housing Matters. Ash, why don't you explain what Housing Matters is and what it does?
Housing Matters is a nonprofit housing advocacy group, but we're slightly different than most other housing advocacy groups in that we are pretty much in favor of market-oriented solutions for fixing the housing problems in Toronto, which is where we're based, but I think nationally and continentally in North America, we favor market-based solutions. We see the problems in rental markets and housing prices as being caused by too much government intervention. So we don't think the problems can be fixed by more intervention. We think we need to just pull back from the interventions.
And I agree with that sentiment, but I think it's pretty controversial, surprisingly so.
Right.
Not among economists, but among the general public, which is probably why we have housing crises in all the major cities of North America. So
yes,
you recently wrote an op-ed for the CBC entitled "Why Low-Income Earners Should Actually Welcome Ontario's Reversal on Rent Control." It accrued over 500 comments and many tweets, most of them negative. Why don't you tell me? So, what was the thrust of that op-ed, and start with what was Ontario's rent control policy that they later reversed?
Right. So I'll give a little bit of history first. The history is that Ontario introduced rent control initially in 1975, and then there was various versions of it expanding and contracting. The latest version, well, in the 90s, it was the Conservative government in 98 made the rent control such that only housing built before 1991 was under rent control. And so for the next few years, there was a so-called loophole where housing built after 1991 wasn't rent controlled. This changed in 2017 when the Kathleen Wynne government introduced a so-called Fair Housing Plan, which had 16 points of policy changes that affected the housing market and rental market in Ontario. One of which was expanding rent control to all units. And rent control here is some arbitrary percentage rate that you can increase at the end of a rental term that's determined by the province. And it's only for it's only for occupied housing. So there's no vacancy control here, as it's called elsewhere, where even if somebody leaves, even if a tenant leaves a housing unit or rental unit, rents it won't be stuck. So if you have a unit right now that you're renting for $1,000 and then you leave, the landlord can raise the rent to whatever he or she wants. But once a new tenant moves in, then they are locked in by what the province sets as a rent control increase. The Ontario government, the current Ontario government, Doug Ford's Ontario government, they 3 weeks ago, they changed this law to be anything built after the passing of that law in November 15th, I think it was. That any building built after or brought to the market after that date is no longer under rent control. So in effect, they've changed the so-called 1991 loophole up to November 2018, and a lot of people were upset about this.
Wait, so okay, so they made it so that housing built up till 2018 could not
up to November 2018.
So okay,
that's right.
So if I have a house that was built in 2000 and I have a tenant there, the new rule is that I can't raise the rent above a certain amount?
That's actually the old rule.
That's the old rule.
The new rule is if you have if you're building a new building, or if you have a previously unoccupied unit, a unit that you've never rented out before, and you bring that onto market, either you constructed it or it was an unused bedroom in your house or something like that, that's no longer under rent control.
Okay. So the new rule then, like, and by no longer under rent control, you mean rent increases, at the end of the month or end of a lease.
That's right.
I as a landlord, I'm not actually a landlord in real life, just in this hypothetical scenario. I could raise, I could double it, I could do anything. But of course, subject to the outside options that my tenant has that they could leave. So it seems like the old form of rent control, the version that just, and I believe it's the same here in BC, like there's a limit to how much you can raise rents. It seems like a fairly benign form of rent control because you still prices can still sort of be flexible so long as there's turnover. When people move out and someone else moves back in, you can still change the price to anything you want. So compared to rent controlled apartments in other places where the rent is just fixed at a certain rate or at a certain rate of increase permanently, at least there's this gradual change, and you might expect that landlords and tenants would want to contractually sort of specify what rate rent is going to change in the future. If this weren't the law, it might be desirable to have some stability in that agreement. So it seems like not the worst.
Right. So it could have been much worse. So the worst thing you can do with rent control is what I alluded to earlier is with so-called vacancy control as well, which is that even if nobody is living in your rental unit, so if a new tenant wants to move in, you still have to give them the old rental rate as the previous tenant. So that would be removing the market incentive a lot. And you're also right that so long as there is movement and flexibility and turnover within the market, then we shouldn't expect this to have too large of an impact. But of course, as we know from both economic theory and the scores of empirical studies on rent control, we know that people who move into rent-controlled buildings are less likely to move out because they will face higher rents. So adding rent control makes the market less liquid than it otherwise would be. And that is a crucial element that
both the housing market and the labor market.
Yes, so that's a separate issue. So people are less likely to move from the current housing unit, which makes the housing market less liquid. But because of this also makes the labor market less liquid as well, which is a finding that a lot of people have a hard time believing. But it's true. It's again, it's not only what economic theory predicts, but we have lots of empirical data on this as well.
Yeah, and just, I mean, in a completely different literature, job searchers who are willing to move have a much higher chance of finding a new job. And that's intuitive, right? Because if you're willing to move to anywhere in the world, you're in a much bigger labor market than someone who is not willing to move and must find a job within a half hour to an hour commute of their home. Just that you can see that being a big problem to sort of lock people into their homes if the local labor market suffers, and now they have to trade off sacrificing their cheap housing for being able to compete in a larger labor market and find better jobs elsewhere.
Right. And this leads to a different question as well, which is it also limits how many people will want to move in or can move into your city to find jobs as well. Because if people aren't moving out of their units, and because landlords, as we know, have less incentive to build new units, because if they'll fall under the same old rent control as the old units. Then we have fewer units being built overall. That brings down the so-called rental vacancy rate, which is the number of rental units available to rent per month or per year. That brings it down. In Toronto right now, it's 0.7%. And when rental vacancy rates are that low, that makes it harder for new people from outside of the city to move in. And that makes it even harder to attract labor from outside of the city. So if you are in a city with a hot job market, like Toronto, you have to pay your employees that much more to attract them to the city because to compensate them for finding expensive rents here.
Yeah, and I kind of it's similar here in Vancouver and in major cities like San Francisco. One thing I had said to someone a while ago as a joke was like, if you went back in time and told someone in 1980 that there was going to be, this huge boom in technology and, many new innovations and we were going to, invent all these new things that were going to change our lives, I think they would have believed you. They would have been like, okay, it's like science fiction. Yeah, flying cars. And then you'd have to explain, well, not flying cars, but other things. But then if you explain to them, oh yeah, and you person in 1980, the people who currently own houses in the San Francisco Bay Area are going to capture a huge portion of the surplus created by this new tech industry without even doing anything. They're not going to, it's not because they're inventing the tech. It's just that they have this resource that tech workers are going to need in order to work in this new industry. And and the city's just not going to let anyone build more housing. And so the people who own the current houses are just going to make a killing, and it's going to, they're like the main beneficiaries there. They'll all be millionaires. I think if you told someone in the past that, they would be shocked.
Of course, because I think if you went back in time to 1980, most of those people you'd be talking to would be young, idealistic types who would be against, corporate monopolies and regulation and all these unfettered capitalism. But what they ended up doing was that they became monopolists in their own right. That they lobbied they lobbied their local governments to give them monopoly power through making stringent regulation on building new housing and rental units. So by creating such a closed market for themselves, they get to collect these monopoly rents that they otherwise wouldn't if it was an open market.
Yeah. One there are a couple barriers, I think, for people understanding these housing issues. If I were one of the typical commenters on your article, your op-ed you wrote, and there were over 500 comments, the main question I'd be asking you right now is, are you a landlord, or are you receiving kickbacks from landlords, or you must be receiving kickbacks from developers, or be a developer yourself, right?
Right. So I am not a landlord. Our organization, of course, has a lot of interest from developers, but we're still fairly young. We don't actually have that much funding. We got a lot of individual funding. We have a lot of interest from developers, of course, and landlords, of course. But as of this moment, we don't have. We're not some rich organization of old boys and old developers and old landlords looking for to jack rental prices higher. We just think that the market is going to bring rents lower. We are in favor of lower rents. And we think the best way to lower rents for everyone is to free the market. And if you favor rent control, you're in fact favoring higher rent prices, a tighter market, and more difficult opportunities to move into the city and within the city for existing tenants.
Yeah, and I just I bring up that point about like the developer shill or landlord shill accusation, because it seems like people have this view of housing or of policy in general, that like policies have the obvious impact, that the results of policies are clear, and you can just sort of read the title. It's rent control, so it must control rents. And then the reason there's debate on them is because of, greed or personal interest, right? People, the sort of assumption that everyone agrees that rent control helps low-income people, but some people oppose rent control because they don't want to help low-income people. They want to help themselves at the expense of low-income people. And then arguments that rent control doesn't help are seen as disingenuous and, just sort of special pleading for one's own self-interest. Slate Star Codex, I believe, called this the conflict theory of disagreement, as opposed to the mistake theory, the idea that when there are two sides on an issue, it's because one of the sides made, the other side, presumably, whichever side you're on, made some kind of mistake, but they were still arguing in good faith. This is the other side knows what they're doing, and they just have different interests. But yeah,
I want to talk about this issue a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So the top comment right now on the that I'm seeing on my on this article on CBC is that I am a paid shill, paid for my opinion, right? And this attacking people for the source of their income, attacking scientific research based on the funding, the source of its funding, to me is very strange. If I was, say, a nutritionist and I was paid by the dairy cartel in Canada to promote or to study the effects of milk, and I say, if someone who drinks milk, they get more calcium, and from other research we know that calcium promotes bone density and reduces the risk of profit. Therefore, drinking milk reduces your osteoporosis. So therefore, drinking milk
slipping out of the metaphor
decreases.
there.
Right. Therefore, drinking milk reduces your risk of osteoporosis. People would question this by saying, "Oh, you were paid by the milk lobby. We don't see your data, and you might be missing out on bringing in other data and looking at the issue from other angles." But when we're talking about economics, which to me is almost like a branch of logic, I'm just laying out in this article, the first half of this article anyway, a logical case that by restricting the maximum price for something, you're going to restrict the supply of that thing. This is a logical statement. And by being accused of being in the pockets of, big landlords and big developers, is this an attack on my logic? Do you think people are suspicious of my, or maybe thinking I took part in some sort of logical shenanigan? I just don't understand. I'm laying out my logic for everyone to see. It's not like I'm working with secret data. I cite some research. The research uses, the surveys use public data, but the research paper in question, although this uses some proprietary information, but there's lots of other research that you can look into yourself to find that uses public information. So what do you think
so
it is?
The point you're making is, yep.
Yeah, I guess my point is, when someone accuses an economist of all sciences of who's writing a public opinion, where most of the time the case is based on simple economic logic, and they're accusing the author of being a shill for whatever corporation or capitalists in general, what have you, is it that people think there can be tricks in logic that are being played? You can ignore some things that would have an negative effect on your prescribed conclusion. What do you think that is?
Yeah, so you're saying that your reasoning is out in the open, and that someone can read it and follow along. And so they should be able to read what you've written and find the error, or not find the error if there isn't one, because it's all out there, right? Whereas if you were
Exactly.
working on, something really esoteric, like your example of, the effect of milk on the human body, you might think, a lot of things are happening behind the scenes, and you might think that the researcher may have put their thumb on the scale one way or the
Right.
other, or there might be, they might have done a bunch of different analyses and put all the ones that didn't come out the right way in the file drawer, all sorts of ways that you could sort of manipulate the answer. But the logic here is very clear, and people should be able to, to evaluate it on its own merits rather than wondering. It's not that it's always wrong to wonder about the motives of the person presenting you with some evidence, but in this particular case, there's just in this particular case, it does not make sense.
Not to me, but I'm wondering if you have any idea on this. Does it make sense to you to question someone's intentions when they're presenting to you a logical argument?
I think definitely does not.
Right.
Maybe if it were 1,000 pages long and you were only hearing the conclusion, then the cost of engaging with it, at the level of reading it and coming to a conclusion would be so costly that you might want to make your argument at the level of, okay, do I trust this person? Like it's not always wrong to either believe or disbelieve a conclusion based on who is making it, just because there are costs to reading all the evidence yourself, or engaging with every argument you hear on a deep level. But for this, the cost is so low that people really should just engage with the things you were saying. But let's get back to housing in particular. I think one of the reasons people misunderstand it so badly is because things are framed in terms of an affordability crisis. But really, you could frame it one of two ways: as a housing affordability crisis, or as a critical housing shortage. And if you if you apply the logic of supply and demand to that, those two things are going to be the same. Although I suppose shortage kind of implies, in the technical language of economics, shortage implies that the pricing is not correct. But the idea that we are not building enough housing for all the people who want to live in a given place, and the idea that housing is too expensive, if you have a solid theory of supply and demand, those are very connected statements. In fact, they might be identical statements. But if you don't have that background of connecting prices with quantities, then you're going to think housing affordability is a problem because of maybe greed, because maybe there aren't laws to keep prices down, because the buildings that you see being built are fancy and have nice amenities, and so you label them luxury, and then say, why are we building luxury homes for the rich? That's a particularly irritating argument. What would you say to someone who made that argument?
Right. So I think what a lot of people miss is that prices and quantities go hand in hand. This is the fundamental insight of economics, in my opinion, that you cannot divorce price from a quantity, or quantity from price. If you're limiting prices, you're going to limit quantities. If you're limiting quantities, you're going to affect prices. On the matter of luxury homes specifically, if you build more luxury homes, that doesn't mean you have to destroy the previous existing housing stock to do this. This makes all the other homes in the neighborhood, in the city, in the region, that much less expensive because there's now competition. If you wanted to buy a home and there's only one home available for $500,000, you would have to pay $500,000 for this home. If suddenly next door they they build a new home worth $5 million, you now have an option. If you had $5 million, you now had an option to buy this $5 million home. But the person selling the $500,000 home, they might try to entice you by maybe lowering the price a little bit or trying to entice you some other way. And of course, one-on-one, this is difficult to imagine, but in a whole city where usually we have, in the cases of Toronto and in San Francisco, places we've talked about, but I know this is a problem elsewhere, is that we have land use restrictions that through zoning effectively eliminate huge chunks of land within the city for building new housing. And when you do that, you're making harder to build new homes, especially new homes to compete with old homes. So just building more homes, increasing the quantity of a good necessarily has to decrease the price. It has to. That's simple, basic economic logic.
Yeah, I mean, there are some assumptions packed into there that that other aspects don't change, right?
Right. So to jump in there, it has to be a homogeneous good. So it has to be the same good. So people will talk about so-called Veblen goods and Giffen goods. I think if you're interested in that discussion, there's a great paper by Peter Klein on Giffen goods, Peter G. Klein on Giffen goods and luxury goods, where effectively at certain prices or quantities, a good becomes fundamentally different. It becomes a fundamentally different good. A nice example I like to think about is iron jewelry during the First World War in Germany. Germany needed gold the German government needed gold for the war effort, and the rich Germans were asked to donate their gold jewelry. And if they did so, they received cast iron, black iron jewelry as a replacement. And of course, iron is much cheaper than gold. But because it represented a status, it wasn't just another piece of iron jewelry. It became much more valuable than typical iron jewelry. So subjectively, people viewed iron jewelry given from the German government to those who gave in their gold for the war effort as subjectively different. They valued it different as other iron jewelry, and so they priced it differently. And so if you're drawing the supply, therefore that stops you from drawing supply and demand curves for all iron jewelry. You now have to draw supply and demand curves for this cast iron war jewelry. And for this war jewelry, if they supplied more of those, if they gave each person who gave one gold ring, they gave them like 15 gold rings or 15 iron rings as a replacement, then the value of those iron rings, iron replacements, would have been much lower because it then has to follow the law of supply and demand for a homogeneous good. But if we're assuming housing per se is a homogeneous good, then increasing the quantity of housing has to decrease the price.
Mm-hmm. And let's just think about so with the iron jewelry, it's valuable because of what it represents. It's valuable because of status and the social context of it, and making more of it does not change the conference of status or the social context or anything like that. But let's talk about housing in particular. So everyone needs housing. If you are homeless, if you are literally sleeping outside, that is the main thing about your life. It doesn't matter what other goods and services you have access to. I mean, like, if you don't have food, you will literally die. But you can't. Let's say you couldn't afford a home and you were living on the street, but you could somehow someone donated you like a big flat screen TV. You can't consume that, right? It's almost nothing has any value to you if you don't have a home to put it in. Besides food and water and basic necessities. The way people
Sure.
consume more or less food is by having, more or less housing is by having more people under one roof. So, do you live with your parents till you're 18, then move out? That used to be a thing. Or do you live with your parents till you're 30 before you move out? That's how you consume less housing. Or do your elderly parents move back in with you when they turn 70? Do you have roommates? Do you not have roommates? That's where the slope of the demand curve for housing comes from. People, it's not that people just go without a house and lots of people are homeless, although some people certainly are. But it's mostly that just the degree to which people are packed in and sharing homes.
Right. So private square footage, access to private square footage, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to housing. So housing is slightly different than other goods. So most people buy housing on credit. This wasn't always the case in a lot of countries where credit is less available. It isn't the case. It still isn't the case. Where most you buy a house all in cash. Rent is still on a credit basis though. So when you're renting out a unit, you need to have reasonably good credit so that the landlord trusts you that you will continue paying rent over the long term, or at least the term of your contract. When we have a situation like rent control, this actually creates more incentives for the landlord to require a higher credit worthiness from their tenants, because the landlord recognizes that once someone moves in under rent control, they're less likely to move out. So the landlord now has to have someone even more trustworthy than beforehand, than otherwise. So how do they do this? They do this through income statements, through personal letters, through reference checks, all these other manners of so-called non-price discrimination, which are in effect credit checks on the potential tenant. And that actually makes it even more difficult for low-income, younger, low credit individuals to find housing in the first place.
Yeah, housing, you can think about two ends of the spectrum in terms of, transactions. One is the one and done kind of, you go to the store, you hand over the money, you get the thing, and that's it. And that doesn't require a lot of trust. It's just kind of, who you'll generally not screen people for their personal characteristics or care much who your customers are. It's just whoever can pay. That's your customer base.
Right.
But then on the other end of the spectrum is, a marriage, right? Where you're committed for a, very long and extensive relationship with the person, and you have to sacrifice other opportunities for the whole length of this, and it's very costly to pull out. And for that kind of transaction, you're going to have an extreme amount of screening. And what you're saying then is that a landlord-tenant relationship is closer to the marriage end of the spectrum, and that these rent control policies that encourage, that encourage these relationships to last longer. Also, we haven't talked about the way disputes between landlords and tenants are adjudicated. It's different in every jurisdiction, but I know in British Columbia, every new rule is designed to favor tenants. So the
right.
Kicking out a bad tenant is virtually impossible. My father-in-law owns a lot of low-income housing and rents it out, and just it's hard to even evict someone who's like making death threats to other people. Like, it's someone who is just very clearly a bad actor. The deck is so stacked in favor of the tenant that you can't, if someone is bad, it's very difficult to get rid of them in all but the most extreme circumstances, and so just having if you're going to get into a landlord-tenant agreement with someone, you have to be certain, you have to have very high confidence that they are going to be a good tenant, that they're not going to ruin the place, that they're going to pay their rent on time, and just that they're not going to add additional costs to you. Are they going to be calling you, twice a week, or are they going to, go years and years without ever needing to call you, except the occasional maintenance call? That's a huge deal. And just knowing this, you might not even want to get into the business of supplying housing, just with the inherent risk that comes from entering a relationship, having to enter a relationship for the long term, that you may not be able to pull out of.
Right. So this is 100% true. So the more difficult you make it to evict the tenants is almost like making it difficult to, going back to your marriage analogy, it's making it difficult to get a divorce. So if you make it legally difficult to get a divorce, you're in fact subsidizing or otherwise favoring abusive partners in marriages. And you see the same thing happen right now with in terms of tenants. There are many abusive tenants towards landlords, and the landlord can't do anything, even though everyone agrees that the tenant is being a jerk. But the laws in place favor the tenants in such a way that it has to be something very, very, very extreme in order to justify an eviction. Back to the plight of the homeless. I wonder actually how much of the plight of the homeless has to do with land use zoning, land use planning, and the laws around setting up mobile homes or temporary homes, such as tents, such as tiny homes. You can even think of those that way. It's Toronto. Maybe the demand isn't there so much because of our extreme weather, extremely cold weather in the winter at least. But in other places in California, where it's hard to buy land in order to set up these tiny homes. And if you do set up a tiny home, the city can ask you to tear it down. There have been many cases where people have built tiny homes out of charity, and the city has asked them to be destroyed or has otherwise evicted the tenants, right? So there's all these regulations limiting the supply of housing. So not everyone wants to live in a giant McMansion, as it's called, or even in a condo. They'd be happy living in a small place out in the woods. But because the government owns the woods, they're not good. They're actually not a very good landlord. They won't, or they're not a very generous landlord. They don't want people who aren't paying them to live there. Whereas in the old days, in the old frontier days, for example, you went out into the country, a man would build his own house. He would homestead the land, and that was your house. But here in the city, there's a lot of old, virtually abandoned land, but no one's allowed to live there because it's been zoned for more employment, quote unquote, employment usage, where they got to build another factory or something. On this very issue of zoning, in Ontario, we have in the City of Toronto Act, there is, in the 2006 version, they included a line that limits the demolition of rental properties. The city has a right to veto the demolition of rental properties. If you are an owner of a rental building with 6 or more units, and you want to demolish it for a reason, mostly to build some non-rental units, the city can veto you and disapprove of your desire to demolish the building and essentially put people out of housing. Some might say that this is justified because it's already so hard to find rental housing in the city. But the reason it's so hard to find rental housing is because the regulations, the interventions have made it so difficult to bring new rental housing on the market that landlords are incentivized to not want to get into the market and to exit the market ASAP. But they have to intervene to correct the faults of their old interventions. And so this is if readers are interested in this, they can Google something called the Dynamics of Interventionism. Sanford Akita has a great article on this. Murray Rothbard, in his book Power and State, has a great section on this. And it's just always, you have one intervention, it has unseen, or, we're led to believe unseen or unintended consequences, which then further require more interventions down the line. And those also have, quote unquote, unseen or unintended consequences that require even yet more, interventions.
Yeah. There's a naivety to people who build these tiny homes, thinking like, if only we could just build, like, the problem of homelessness is that it's too, we just haven't built enough homes. We can, but we haven't. And, if only we had this low cost option and we could build a bunch of little homes and put the homeless in them. And it's like, it's not that it's not that it's just too expensive to build housing or just no one's thought of it. It's that it's literally illegal to build certain forms of housing. And, I think a lot of the regulations had the idea of like public health, that you wanted to spread people out so that, you didn't have a bunch of people in tight quarters potentially sharing diseases. That's pretty clearly backfired, because now what young people will often do is they'll rent out the rooms in a detached home to like 9 different people, and so they're still effectively living in, that's the way they get the density that they require in order to just be able to afford to live. But you can't purpose
but
build
illegally, and
yeah,
right.
Often it's illegal, and but hard to enforce, and you can't purpose build a dormitory style living arrangement, a building where everyone rents a single room with a bed and a desk and a closet. The only legal way to do that is if you're a university, that they have a loophole that lets them do that. But for some reason, you can't do that for adults, for anyone not enrolled in university, just in order to live in the cheapest way, which is to have shared common areas, shared kitchens, bathrooms, and just rent a small room that is as just the bare minimum space you need. Simply legalizing that type of housing would potentially have a big impact on the ability of very low income people to find homes, to just find a place to live, sort of lowering that adding a lowest rung to the housing ladder, just for people who are, can't rent 600 square feet, which is often the minimum.
And some people might expect that only the government would have the incentive to build such housing. But of course, these kinds of housing existed on the market, and it required government intervention to get them out. Many cities in the United States at the turn of the previous century had so-called tenement housing, where it was mostly for workers and their families who worked in the factories in the city. There would be housing nearby for them, for the workers. And as such, because of this, the density in these cities was much higher in 1950 for every major city in the United States. It was the population density of all these cities was higher in 1950 than it is today. Isn't that shocking?
With a much lower population.
With much lower population density was higher because people were allowed to live in smaller quarters. New housing was allowed to be built, but with the rise of land use planning and regulations and all sorts of other interventions into the housing market, we have effectively made it illegal to build cheap housing. And just like it's possible to make a profit selling cheap food, which there's lots of people doing, from Walmart to McDonald's and Burger King to many others, it's also profitable, it can be profitable to build cheap housing so long as it's not made illegal and the regulations aren't too onerous.
Yeah, so a wealthy person can outbid a poor person, for housing, like in terms of the sheer number of dollars. A wealthy person maybe can spend $2,000 a month on housing, and a poorer person maybe can only afford $300 a month. But if you can pack, 10 poor people into the same space that a wealthy person would like to rent, then 300 a month times 10 for 10 smaller units rather than one big one adds up to more than the single wealthy person. So there's strength in numbers, right? So you need to consider that while a wealthy person can pay more total, they also, it also costs more to supply them with the amenities and the space that they'd like to demand. So ultimately, there's a market equilibrium where you serve both the lower and upper end of the market. Which not to mention just that housing, of course, is houses are a durable good, and we haven't even really talked about filtering, but the fact is that there, in any given city, there's going to be housing built this year and last year, and housing built 30 years ago, and in a well-functioning city, there will be churn where you tear down the oldest buildings and build newer ones, and as what's often the case is, the older buildings, which were luxury and new when they were first built, are now the low income housing. In the same way that a luxury car from 2000 is now a much cheaper car because it's 18 years old.
Right. This is again just on insofar as we're allowed to build new housing on new land. Right? If the quantity of land where you're allowed to build new housing is getting ever smaller, then of course the new housing has to replace old housing. And because of the incentives created through rent control and land use planning, you're going to find more high income per square foot and high income or homes aimed at high income individuals replacing homes that aimed at low income individuals. But you would get rid of this problem if you allowed more housing, more different types of housing to be built on larger parcels of land or different parcels of land. If you just increased the square footage of land, and let's be honest, Garrett, there's plenty of land in a place in the world, of course, but also in a big city like Toronto, there's plenty of land. But just most of that land has been legally restricted to only be limited to, detached homes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're limiting a large chunk of the total land in Toronto, and that number, depending on who you ask, is between 40 to 50% of the city of Toronto, of the entire city of Toronto, the land that includes the parks, the rivers, the employment centers, the highways. 50% of that land is zoned for detached homes, and then you get surprised that pricing of housing as in immigration is increasing, is going up. This makes no sense. This to me doesn't strike me as honest when people restrict the quantity of land this way through zoning, and then they act surprised when the price of building on top of this restricted land has to increase.
Yeah,
especially in a context of rising population.
Yeah, there's a tremendous
Isn't that
waste.
strange, Garrett?
Like the most wasted resource in society is cubes of empty space hovering above our major cities. So I say that because you have a single family home, in a prime location in Toronto. There's a ton of there's a cone of just empty space up above that, extending from out from the center of the earth and up into the stratosphere, and it is technologically feasible to build 100-story buildings wherever we want. We cracked that technology when we invented steel frame buildings and elevators. It essentially removed the limits on the height we can build, and but then we just put those limits back with laws because we thought single family homes were nicer. We liked the idea that everyone would have their own little
Well, you got to
yard
be
in the
careful.
quiet neighborhood.
Right. You got to be careful when we say we. Who was we?
Yeah.
Was it we as in all of society, every single individual, or was it we, the incumbent landlords and the incumbent homeowners? Sorry, those of us who had single or detached homes, and then we didn't want a high rise going up next door, or we didn't want someone building. We had a 2-story building. We didn't want someone building a 4-story building next door. So we went to the local, our counselor and said, "Hey, I don't like this guy building a 4-story house 4-plex next to me. He's going to have like 8 people in there. They might be poor. Oh no." And then the counselor comes, joins other counselors, and then who's voting in these elections, in these city council elections? It's the landowners, it's the property owners. Renters don't typically vote. Voters tend to be older property owners, right? Renters don't tend to be voters. And so the older property owners, aka the voters, they vote for these land use restrictions that limit their neighbors on what they can do with their own property.
Yeah, so I have an anecdote. So I grew up in Victoria, BC. It's capital city of British Columbia, and I grew up in a little sort of place called Oak Bay. A lot of single family homes, quiet, and there's a beach there called Willows Beach, and there's an island just off that beach. I forget what its official name is, but we all called it Jimmy Chicken Island for some reason. That island has nothing on it. It's just scrub, and the story behind it is that there was a wealthy person, 100 years ago, who had built a really nice house in this area, one of the first ones, way back. And he was afraid that someone was going to build like a canning plant, because it's island, it's coastal real estate, so you could get the fishing boats to drop off fish there and then can the fish and then ship them somewhere. He was afraid someone would buy that island and use it for that purpose. And so he bought the island, planted the scrub, and just left it empty because he was afraid that someone was going to ruin his view. And to me, that's an example of someone, they want to protect their view, and so they pay for it. He had to pay the money to buy the land to keep it empty. And if that were happening today, what he and his neighbors in that area would have done is got together, talked to the city council and not paid a cent. They would have just blocked any development. If someone else had purchased the land and wanted to build on it, people would get together and for $0 block that use of the land. But what I'm saying is the old way was better, where you had to pay to stop, your neighbors from doing things that you had to outbid them. You couldn't just block anything that imposed some cost on you at zero cost to yourself, because of course, maybe the value of a canning plant, let's just put imaginary numbers on it. Maybe it's 10 million, and maybe the value of your view is only 5 million, right? The combined views of all the people who can see that island. And if that's the case, you want the canning plant. It's the highest value use. And in a world where people need to get together and buy that island to protect their views, they'll get outbid. But if their views were worth 15 million, if they were worth more, then they would outbid the other use. And that makes a lot of sense to me. There's a collective action problem there when there's a lot of people. And so that's, there's some maybe justification for government intervention. But the way it currently works is we are blocking high value uses like building lots of homes for people to live in for low value uses like protecting some guy's view. And we do that because the cost, we've set the cost at zero, the cost of blocking other people's use of their land.
Well, it's, to me, as an economist, the only thing I'm concerned of when I talk about efficiency and waste is whether there has been voluntary exchange made to come up with this, outcome. So with respect to zoning, Houston is a popular example of a city, of a major metropolitan that has very, very limited zoning, legal zoning restrictions. Instead, they have a lot of covenants between property owners. When you buy a piece of property, the old owner will make you sign a contract that says you promise when you buy this property that you won't do X, Y, and Z. And when people have analyzed this issue, they have found that in Houston, you will get at one intersection, you will get a high-rise, a single detached home, a storefront, and then a gas station at different corners. And they say this is actually a very similar outcome that you'll get under zoning as well, where you can get a high-rise, a single detached home, a gas station, and a convenience store. But the difference is that in Houston, that outcome was made through voluntary exchange and using money prices to get to build those things. In zoned cities, these were the results of non-price decisions, decisions based without monetary price. So because of this, we know through the works of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and other Austrian economists in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, that when you're making a decision in a complex economy without money prices, you're going to necessarily make arbitrary decisions that are going to hurt some people and benefit others, and there's no way of telling how much you're hurting some at the expense of others. But when you have voluntary exchange and prices, monetary prices are forming, then you know exactly how much someone is willing to pay to live next to, a convenience store versus how much they're willing to pay to not live next to a convenience store. And you can get very similar outcomes from an aesthetic point of view without zoning. But because these decisions, these outcomes are arrived at through a voluntary process of exchange through economic means, we can deduce that people who made those choices did those voluntarily and that these are their best valued uses, as determined by voluntary exchange. But when a government just comes in and arbitrarily zones one corner to be for gas stations, another corner for residential apartments, another corner for detached homes, and another corner for convenience stores, then we don't know whether that was truly what people wanted to build in that area, or it was just what was politically convenient and feasible.
Right. I think the point you're getting at is that people can have their voices heard. They can affect the outcome, of the market with their dollars, with contractual agreements, with purchasing property and making contracts with the neighboring properties to do something with your land. And there is an alternative. You sort of insinuated the government sort of coming in from the outside and imposing these zoning rules, but at least at the local level, people have a lot of input into that government decision. It's very easy for local groups to control, to have an impact on the city council and just especially in local politics, affect the way things go. It's just that and importantly, it's only locals who do that. So not people who would like to live in your city but can't because you price them out by not building housing for them. But it's just like, although you have in both cases, people have control over what happens in their neighborhood. It's just the costs are different. And
right. In one sense,
and
in
the
one
information.
situation, the costs are voluntary. Right.
Right. And you personally have to pay for what, the things you want in the market scenario.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Another anecdote on this issue is that in Toronto, we have the Eaton Centre, which is named after a retail magnate named Eaton, and he had some enemies in the city. And about 100 years ago, someone owned a piece of land adjacent to the Eaton Center, which was then purchased by the Hudson Bay Company. And the contract they signed with the Hudson Bay Company, and to this day, it still belongs to the Hudson Bay Company, is that when that landowner sold his land to the Hudson Bay Company, in that contract, there was a clause that says that the owner will not sell their house to Mr. Eaton or, his representatives, his agents. So you can contract these things and you can agree to these contracts, and you can have similar outcomes that would, in effect, make sure that you're not building, garbage dumps next to public schools. But you don't need to legally mandate these things. People naturally want to live in nice areas, and some people who don't want to live in nice areas are willing to pay for that in terms of paying lower prices, but they get to be close to pollutants and carcinogens, whatever. That's their choice. If they want to make that choice, that's up to them. My position is only don't have the government impose choices for people.
Right, or don't let the people use their impact, their sway through government to impose their preferences at lower than the cost they impose on others. Is a sort of public economics take on it.
Right. There was another situation in Toronto a few years ago where a family wanted to build an addition at the back of their home, I think, to rent out. And it was about 8 inches or so, maybe 18 inches or so longer than the zoning bylaw permitted. And there was a huge petition that went around in their neighborhood. Well, huge. There was a petition of, a couple dozen signatures of people who lived not next door or across the street from the house in question, but 10 or 15 houses down, worried about the shadows it might cast on their property or something like that, over 18 inches. Why should this be a normalized course of action in any society? I don't understand. Somebody wants to do something on their own property. Only the owner of that property should have a say on that, and maybe their immediate neighbors if they have some sort of relationship there, or if they might cause some problem with their immediate neighbors. But if you're 20 houses down, or if you're in the next block over, why should you be able to stop someone doing something on their property through city council? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
And in societies like...
Well, of course I know. Well, it does make sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, sort of.
Of course it makes sense because I understand public choice, that people want to have this power, and so the government, bends over backwards to give people this power. But this power shouldn't exist. So now that it does exist, what do you do? That's a different question.
There are societies where it's not like that, such as Japan. Japan has a huge population, right. and they build lots and lots of housing. Tearing down old housing and building new housing is something they just do all the time. And if you wanted to stop your neighbor, you'd have to lobby the national government, and that's just and so people just don't. And so their housing costs are right. much lower than every North American city.
Well, per square foot, Tokyo is still, I'm pretty sure it's still one of the top most expensive places in the world, even more so than New York or San Francisco or Toronto for sure. But the difference is, even though per square foot costs are higher in terms of a dollar amount, the per square foot cost in terms of regulation is lower. Therefore, you can build more housing. You just build smaller housing. Whereas in Toronto, because it's so difficult to build new housing, even though per square foot it's cheaper in Toronto to build per square foot than in Tokyo, the regulatory burden makes it more difficult to build. And so it's harder to find housing in Toronto than it is in Tokyo.
So sorry, is that per square foot of land or per square foot of
Per square
housing
foot,
flooring space?
the per square foot cost to buy any piece of property in Japan is higher than per square foot to buy property in Toronto.
Hey listeners, this is Garrett from After the Episode. Just want to make a quick point of clarification to something Ash said. It's true that Tokyo, Japan, is one of the most expensive places in the world per square meter to buy an apartment or home, but it's not true that it's more expensive than New York and San Francisco. Just pulled up some stats for the price per square meter of to buy an apartment in the city center. New York sits at around $14,000. San Francisco sits at about $12,000, and Tokyo sits at about $10,000. So they're comparable, and they're all very expensive. And this is just one set of stats. Keep in mind, and depending on how you measure these things, will come out a little differently. But Tokyo is not more expensive than those two, although it is more expensive than many others. They are all in the top 20. And once again, that's the price to own, not the price to rent, as we'll discuss next. I guess that one of the issues in every discussion of housing is that we often the cost of a house, to buy versus to housing to rent are two very different things. And, that you can think of it as, a house is just an asset that supplies housing, and then the rent is the actual cost of housing. So I think the numbers that I've been looking at are often rental rates, which I believe are fairly low. Like Osaka, a city like Osaka has just very low rental rates. Even if the value of land, even if the value of a home is pretty high. I'm not certain of what that is, but renting is quite cheap. And like you say, there are many small housing options. So people do live in very small spaces in Japan, which makes sense because they have a huge population on a small island, and or set of islands. And of course, people want to live in high density. In general, if you let people, they will live in very high density because the cost is so much. The cost of amenities, the cost of transportation, they're all much lower, and incidentally, so is the effect on the environment per person. Just as a side note, although that's not necessarily something people consider when they're buying homes, but it should be a consideration of public policy. Yeah. So, do you have any? We've gone over time, but I could talk about this topic, without end. Do you have any closing thoughts? Any sort of like central takeaways that people should have when they're thinking about housing and rent control and any of the topics we've discussed?
I think the most important thing is to think about housing like any other good, is that if you limit the supply or the price, you should expect the same outcomes in housing as you would in any other good. If you limit the supply, that's a quota. If you limit the price, that's a price ceiling. And just like we have quotas and price ceilings in a million different areas of the economy, and we see the disasters there, you should use those same goggles to look at housing. And when you look at housing, rent prices especially, you say, rent control, we need rent control because rents are too darn high. Then you're limiting the maximum price of housing. And as such, you should expect less mobility, less transactions, less supply, shortages, basically. And that's going to make it harder for people to get rental housing.
Yeah, just to add, I think every kid thinks like, wouldn't it be great if everything were free? And then their parents tell them, well, like, would you make stuff if everything were free? Where would the stuff come from? People would run to the stores and then they'd all be empty. And there's this real constraint, and you have to explain to kids that like having everything be free is not the same as having infinite stuff. But then we kind of fall into this trap as adults where, we don't, as long as you don't set it at 0, people don't have that same intuition that like, wouldn't it be great if everything were 15% cheaper? And it's like, the logic's the same, right? In the same way that making everything free would not work, making it 15% cheaper or some percentage cheaper would have the same downsides, the same negative consequences, just scaled down. And it's frustrating when otherwise intelligent people just sort of willfully miss this point. So my guest today has been Ash Navabi. Ash, thanks for being on Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks, Garrett. Always a pleasure.